Today I'm going to show you how to make a 1x1 left-leaning cable and a 1x1 right-leaning cable. I use these techniques in a few of my patterns and they're much easier to do without a cable needle. Well, most people find them easier to do without a cable needle. It's much faster to do without a cable needle and less cumbersome. So I'll start by knitting my two edge stitches. On my swatch here I've got two little edge stitches, so I'll get those out of the way. And then the first thing I'll do is a right leaning 1x1 cable. So it takes place over two stitches, and that's these two stitches here. And the first thing I'll do is knit into the front of the second stitch along. So that is this here, but I'm not going to drop any stitches off the needles. I just knit into that stitch and then I'm just going to separate it with my thumb so I can knit now into the first stitch. So I'm knitting into the front of the first stitch. Now that I've knit into both stitches, I can then drop the stitches off the left needle. So what's occurred there is that I have now crossed those two stitches, and it's a right leaning cross. So the second stitch is crossing over the front. The next thing I'll do is a left leaning cable, and that will occur over these two stitches. So the first thing I'll do is work the second stitch, but this time instead of knitting into the front of the stitch, I'm going to knit into the back of the stitch. So I'll turn the work over here and I'm going to put my needle into the back of the stitch just like that and knit it like normal. And now I'll work into the front of the first stitch. And even though that does twist, effectively twists that second stitch, I haven't found that it makes any difference to the look or the feel of the work. So then I have crossed these two stitches, and you can see that the cross is a left leaning cross, so that stitch is crossing over the front to the left. I'm going to do a right leaning cross or right leaning 1x1 cable now. So I'll knit into the front of the second stitch, and now I'll knit into the front of the first stitch. Now that I've worked both stitches, I can now drop the stitches off the left needle. So those stitches have been crossed. Now I'll do a left leaning 1x1 cable. So I'll knit into the back of the second stitch first. And now I'll knit into the front of the first stitch. So those stitches have been crossed. I'll do a right leaning 1x1 cable. And now I'll do a left leaning 1x1 cable. And you might know these stitches called by a different name perhaps. I have seen them called different names before. And the last one will be a left leaning. And I'll just knit my two edge stitches so that they match the ones at the beginning. So I've got my row of crossed stitches. It'll be a bit more apparent after I've done the next row. So I turn my work and I'm going to knit my edge stitches, and I'll bring my yarn forward because this is the wrong side of the work, and I just purl everything. This might not be what your pattern using 1x1 cables does, but in this example that's what's happening. You might be be working in the round in your pattern, in which case you'll probably knit the next row. So I'm just purling all my stitches down to the other end. Sometimes the crossed stitches can sit very close to each other in the next row, and you might need to manually separate them so that you can work them. I'm just knitting my last 2 stitches, my edge stitches there. So when I turn my work back over, what I can see is my little crossed stitches here. When I work another row of crossed stitches, I'm going to work them in the opposite manner. So in the previous row, the first one I did was a right leaning cable. This time I'm going to start with a left leaning cable. So I'll knit into the back of the second stitch. Now I'll knit into the front of the first stitch. So that is now left leaning. So the next one was a left leaning. Now I'll do a right leaning one. So I'll knit into the front of the second stitch. Now I'll knit into the front of the first stitch. I'll follow that with a left leaning stitch where I knit into the back first, then into the front of the first stitch. And see how I'm only working into one stitch at a time. I'm not knitting them together, just one stitch at a time. This one in particular, the left leaning, can be confusing to people. I actually prefer doing the left leaning one over the right leaning one. I find it a little bit easier, but everyone has their own preference. And just a few more. And then I'll knit my edge stitches, and then I'll do my wrong side row, and it will make this pattern a little more apparent, I believe, I hope. So I'm just purling my wrong side row. I'll just get a little more yarn, just purling my wrong side row. And when you work them offset like I just have in this row, in the previous row, pardon me, you'll see I've created a little bit of a honeycomb effect. I'll show you when I turn over this work to the right side. Where the cables go in and out, in and out. My 2 little edge stitches, so you can see what's happening there is that it's going in, creating these little bumps and holes. A little bit of a honeycomb effect. And hopefully that's helpful.